You're sitting across from your husband at the dinner table. He says something, you respond, he laughs at the right moment. You ask about his day, he asks about yours. The food is warm, the wine is open. By every visible measure, this is a normal evening in a normal marriage. But you know something is wrong. Not dramatic wrong, not fight wrong, not the kind of wrong that has a name or a cause or a clear beginning. Just a distance. A few feet of table between two people who share a bed, share a name, share children. And still, something is not touching. You've been trying to name it for months. Maybe longer. We're roommates. That's the word your sister used when her marriage ended. You remember thinking, not us, not like that. We're fine. And yet, there is a particular kind of loneliness that only exists inside a marriage, where you are never alone. And still, somehow, alone. Where the person across from you knows you better than anyone alive and still does not see something essential that you cannot name or point to or explain. You don't know when it started. You don't know if he feels it too. And that might be the most frightening part. Because if he doesn't feel it, what does that mean? Before we go further, if this is already touching something real for you, the subscribe button tells YouTube to keep bringing you this kind of conversation. Because what I'm about to share is the part that nobody talks about. Not in marriage counseling, not in most homilies, not in the books about communication and love languages and emotional intimacy. But Padre Pio talked about it. In ways that made people leave his confessional in tears. Not of shame, but of sudden, terrible recognition. If this channel and these conversations matter to you, a subscribe costs nothing and tells the algorithm to keep finding the people who need to hear this. Stay with me. I need to tell you something that has been weighing on me since I started studying Padre Pio's letters in depth. I spent 35 years teaching theology to high school students in Covington, Kentucky. Marriage, sacraments, Humanae Vitae. I knew the doctrine. I taught the doctrine. What the Church teaches about the nature of the marital bond, what the Catechism says, what the pastoral guidelines recommend for Catholic couples navigating difficult decisions. And I'll be honest, I thought I knew the whole picture. Then, in 2018, I attended a conference by Father Ripperger. He is an exorcist, a trained philosopher and psychologist, one of the most rigorous minds in the Catholic world when it comes to the intersection of spiritual reality and human psychology. I had assigned his work in senior theology electives. I admired him from a distance. He said something that stopped me cold. He said that in his years of exorcism and spiritual direction, he had observed a consistent pattern in the marriages he encountered. Couples who had practiced contraception, particularly for extended periods, showed a specific kind of spiritual deterioration in their relationship. Not always dramatic, not always obvious, not the kind that shows up in any counselor's intake form, but consistent. He described it as the severing of a spiritual circuit. I went home that evening and sat in this study for a long time. The green lamp on, the theology books around me. A cup of coffee going cold, because I had taught marriage theology for 3 decades. I had assigned chapters from Humanae Vitae. I had discussed the moral dimension of contraception with hundreds of students. But the mechanism Ripperger was describing, the actual spiritual anatomy of what happens, I had never taught that. I am not sure I had ever fully understood it. So I started reading. Not the textbooks this time. The primary sources. Padre Pio's letters. His biographers. The documented accounts from his confessional. The testimonies of the people he directed. And what I found was something I was not prepared for. Padre Pio was known for his severity in the confessional. That is not controversial. It is documented extensively in the Epistolario, in the accounts of his spiritual directors, in the testimonies of the thousands who came to him over decades. He refused absolution, not often, but definitively, in cases where he judged the penitent was not genuinely resolved to change. He was not cruel about this, but he was clear, unflinchingly clear, and some people left his confessional feeling the sting of that clarity before they understood why they needed it. Among the sins that most disturbed him, and this appears repeatedly across multiple independent accounts, were sins against marriage, against the sacramental integrity of the conjugal bond, against the openness to life that he considered not a rule imposed from outside, but a reality written into the structure of what marriage is. He would say, in ways that were gentle and devastating at the same time, that matrimony was ordered toward children, that God, when a couple married, had already determined, in some mysterious way that Pio took very seriously, how many souls that union was meant to bring into the world. And when a couple deliberately closed themselves to that, they were not merely violating a rule, they were breaking something. One account describes a woman who came to his confessional, a devout woman, daily communicant, a woman who would have described herself as a faithful Catholic. She expected simple absolution. Instead, Padre Pio told her, quietly, that she needed to reconsider what she was doing to her marriage, not the morality of it. Though that was present too, the structure of it. What she was, as he put it, undoing. She did not fully understand what he meant. Not at the time. She left confused, a little hurt, vaguely troubled. She understood years later. When her marriage, which had appeared perfectly fine from the outside, had quietly become something she could only describe as two people living parallel lives in the same house. I want you to sit with that phrase for a moment. Parallel lives, in the same house, because I suspect some of you know exactly what that feels like, and some of you have been trying to figure out, for a very long time, how you got there. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. There is a couple, I will call them David and Catherine, names changed to protect them, because they gave me permission to share their story but not their names, who were married for 11 years before they encountered a talk by Dr. Ripperger. They had used contraception for the first 7 years of their marriage. Not because they were rejecting church teaching, they simply put it off. Small apartment, busy careers, not the right time yet. They told themselves they would revisit it later. Later came and went several times. Catherine later wrote about those 7 years. She said, "Nothing dramatic happened. There was no betrayal, no crisis, no defining moment where everything shifted. It was more like a gradual draining of something she could not name. Their conversations became logistical. Their evenings became parallel. He had his world. She had hers. They were pleasant to each other. They were functional. Anyone who saw them at a party or at Mass would have thought, there goes a solid couple." She wrote, "I didn't realize we had become roommates until we stopped being roommates." When they changed course, when they stopped using contraception and began natural family planning, Catherine described the first month as strange. She said it sounded impossible, but she felt like she was meeting him again for the first time. Not meeting a new person. Meeting the same man she had always known, but through a different kind of sight. Her husband described it differently. He said he had started seeing her again. Seeing her, as if something had been standing between his eyes and the person he had married. A film, a filter, and the removing of that thing was so gradual he had not noticed it happening, until it was gone. Now I want to say something carefully, because this is the part where I do not want to overstate. I am not saying every marriage that uses contraception falls apart. I am not saying every couple that experiences this kind of distance is experiencing it for this specific reason. Marriage is complicated. Human beings are complicated. There are 100 reasons a marriage can grow cold, and I would not be honest if I collapsed all of them into a single cause. But Padre Pio's specific concern, and Ripperger's specific observation, was not about morality as a legal code imposed from outside. It was about mechanism, about something happening in the spiritual architecture of a marriage that contraception consistently disrupts in a way that other sins do not. And in 2018, when I first began to understand what that mechanism was, I realized I had been teaching the moral argument for 35 years without ever understanding the spiritual physics underneath it. Let me try to explain what I mean. The Catholic understanding of the marital act is not merely biological. It is sacramental. When a man and woman marry, something happens that is not just legal or social or even psychological. A spiritual bond is created that Scripture describes as one flesh, not a metaphor, not a poetic expression, a real union in the spiritual order. The marital act within that bond does something specific. It renews and deepens the union. It is not merely physical intimacy, it is an act that participates in the mystery of the bond itself. It is, as Humanae Vitae puts it, both unitive and procreative, and these two dimensions are not separable without consequence in the spiritual order. What contraception does at that level, and this is Ripperger's core observation, confirmed by other exorcists who work with spiritually afflicted marriages, is introduce a rupture between these two dimensions. The unitive element is preserved, or appears to be. The act happens, but the procreative dimension has been deliberately severed from it, and in severing it, something in the spiritual circuit is interrupted. Think of it this way, and I recognize this is an imperfect analogy because spiritual realities resist simple comparisons, but bear with me. Imagine a live wire, current flowing through it, and someone introduces a deliberate break in the circuit. The lights do not go off immediately. They may flicker, they may dim so gradually that months pass before anyone thinks to ask why the room feels darker. Things continue functioning, but something that should be flowing is not flowing. Ripperger describes contraception as creating exactly this kind of break, not in the visible realm, but in the spiritual one. The act that was designed to strengthen the bond between spouses, to renew that one flesh reality, to deepen what God joined, is now doing something different, something partial, something that touches the surface of union without completing it in the order for which it was made. And over time, that partiality accumulates. This is not metaphor to Ripperger. It was not metaphor to Padre Pio. Padre Pio, in his confessional, was not reacting to an abstract moral category. He was reacting to what he saw, what his gift of supernatural knowledge, the gift of reading souls that is documented across hundreds of testimonies, revealed to him. And what he saw, consistently, was damage, spiritual damage to a marital bond that looked intact on the outside, a bond that the couple themselves could not feel fraying, because the fraying was happening at a level below the visible. He could see what the couple could not. That was the source of his grief. That was the source of his severity. Think about your own marriage for a moment. Not the public version of it. The one you describe to family, to friends, to the couples you see at Sunday Mass. The version where everything is mostly fine and you are grateful and there is nothing dramatic to report. The private version. Have you experienced a shift that you could not explain? Not an affair, not a crisis, not a visible rupture, but a kind of drift, a gradual replacement of something warm and present with something functional and correct but somehow hollow, a sense that the person across from you is a known stranger, someone you know everything about and still cannot quite reach. There is a particular quality to this experience that I have heard described dozens of times in almost identical language by people who were otherwise very different from each other. They say, "We love each other. I know we love each other, but something is not there." Not there, as if something that should be present, something neither of them can name or locate, is simply absent. And the absence is so familiar by now that it has become the texture of the marriage itself. The husband who started treating his wife, as one woman described it, like she was there for him, not abusive, not hostile, just instrumental, functional. a partner. Not a person, a presence in the house, rather than a face he searched for in a room. The wife who feels spiritually empty and does not know why, who goes to Mass, prays the rosary, makes her confession. But something is blocked. She can feel it. A thickness, a barrier between her and the grace she is reaching for. The couple who cannot remember the last time they looked at each other the way they did in the beginning. I do not say this to diagnose your marriage. I am not qualified to do that, and even if I were, it would not be my place. I say it because Padre Pio would have recognized exactly what you are describing. And he would have had a very specific response. Not a lecture. Not a list of sins. A response that looked directly at the mechanism. Here is something that many Catholics have either forgotten or never knew. In 1968, Pope Paul VI released an encyclical called Humanae Vitae, of human life. It was one of the most controversial documents in modern Catholic history. The world expected it to approve contraception. It did the opposite, and the backlash was significant. Theologians dissented publicly. Priests refused to teach it. The encyclical became, for much of the Catholic world, something to be set aside quietly. But Paul VI made a series of specific predictions in that document. Not vague spiritual warnings. Specific, observable predictions about what would happen to marriages, to society, to the way men related to women, if contraception became normalized. He wrote, and I am reading this directly because the exact language matters, that a man who becomes accustomed to contraceptive practices may finally lose respect for the woman, and no longer caring for her physical and psychological equilibrium, may come to the point of considering her as a mere instrument of selfish enjoyment, and no longer as his respected and beloved companion. 1968. He wrote that in 1968, 58 years ago. He was considered an alarmist at the time, a frightened, out-of-touch cleric imposing outdated sexual morality on a liberating world. Now, look around you. Look at how men speak about women in popular culture. Look at the pornography epidemic and what decades of research say it does to the way the male brain processes the women in its actual life. Look at the commodification of female bodies in entertainment, in advertising, in the language of casual relationships, and look at your own marriage if you are honest enough to look there. Does any part of what Paul VI described, the woman reduced to an instrument of enjoyment, the man who stops seeing her as a companion and begins to see her as a presence that serves a function, does any faint echo of that live somewhere in your experience? I am not asking to provoke. I am asking because Paul VI was not speculating. He was, in some way I find difficult to explain from a purely natural standpoint, seeing. He was seeing what Padre Pio saw in the confessional, the direction of travel, the mechanism and its destination, where the severing of that spiritual circuit leads when it is practiced across months and years and decades. And the destination he described is not theoretical. It is the destination that millions of ordinary, well-intentioned, loving marriages have quietly arrived at without ever understanding how they got there. You are not alone in this. That might sound inadequate. It might sound like the thing someone says when they don't know what else to offer, but I mean it in a very specific way. There are Catholic forums, ordinary places where ordinary people write honestly about ordinary marriages, where this experience appears with a frequency that would disturb you if you read enough of it. 7 years of using contraception, and I genuinely cannot explain why our marriage felt like we were roommates. Nothing dramatic happened. It just drained. We stopped the pill after my husband read Humanae Vitae. I am not exaggerating when I say the first month without it felt like meeting him again for the first time. I feel spiritually empty and I don't know why. I go to Mass. I pray. I do everything right. But something is blocked. My husband started treating me differently after we started using contraception. Not abusive, not dramatic. Just like I was there for him. Like a convenience. I didn't make the connection until years later. These are not descriptions of failing marriages. They are not descriptions of couples who stopped loving each other or who had fundamental incompatibilities that surfaced with time. They are descriptions of marriages that looked, from every external angle, perfectly fine, functional, pleasant, adequate, and hollow. Something missing that neither partner could identify or locate. A warmth replaced gradually and imperceptibly by a kind of efficient affection, correct in its gestures, present in its habits, empty of its substance. When I read those descriptions, I think of something Father Gabriele Amorth, for decades the chief exorcist of Rome, said about spiritual oppression. He said the most dangerous form of oppression is not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announces itself. The dangerous kind is the gradual kind, the kind that settles over a person or a marriage so slowly that by the time anyone recognizes it, it has become the new normal. The new normal. That phrase should disturb us, because the new normal in many Catholic marriages where people are going to Mass and sending their children to Catholic school and contributing to the parish fundraiser, is exactly what Paul VI predicted and what Padre Pio saw. And most of the couples living inside it have no idea that what they are experiencing has a name, a cause, and a door, an invisible door. That is the phrase I keep returning to. Because here is what Ripperger describes and what Catholic Answers has articulated in its theological study of contraception and spiritual struggle. Human procreation has everything to do with the immense war between God and the enemy for the destiny of the human race. That is not rhetorical flourish. That is the theological reality of what children represent in Catholic understanding. Every new life that enters the world is a soul that was not there before, a person who will live forever, in eternity, and who, in the Catholic view, is specifically desired, specifically intended, specifically loved into existence by God. The enemy knows this, and therefore the enemy has a particular interest in the question of human reproduction, not merely in its moral dimension, but in its spiritual one, in the way the act of creation, the participation of a husband and wife in God's own creative work, can be redirected, interrupted, made into something that resembles itself without being itself. Ripperger has described a sequence that he and other exorcists have observed in their pastoral work over many years. It begins, often, with contraception, the act that was designed to be ordered toward life, to participate in the mystery of bringing new souls into the world, is deliberately redirected away from that purpose. The spiritual circuit is broken. And when a spiritual circuit breaks, there is an opening, not automatically, not in every case, not inevitably, but consistently. In the pastoral experience of those who deal with spiritual affliction professionally, who have spent decades in the confessional and in exorcism, that opening provides a foothold that would not otherwise exist. This is the invisible door. Not visible to the couple. Not visible in any secular framework. Not visible to the marriage counselor, the therapist, the well-meaning friend who suggests date nights and better communication, but visible according to testimony that stretches across centuries of Catholic mystical experience, from the Desert Fathers through the great exorcists of the 20th century, to those who can perceive the spiritual order. Padre Pio could see it. What he saw in those confessionals, what caused him to refuse absolution not in cold judgment, but in something closer to grief, was the damage, a marital bond that had been, in a very specific and spiritual sense, opened, left exposed, quietly entered, not by catastrophe, not by dramatic failure, by the slow, patient working of an influence that the couple had unknowingly permitted. Stay with me here. This is where it matters, because up to this point, if you have been listening, as someone who already practices natural family planning, or as someone who holds the Church's position on this from conviction, much of what I have said is familiar. Difficult, perhaps, sobering, but not entirely new. But if you have been listening as someone who has used contraception, who uses it now, who had never once thought about it in any of these terms, I want to speak to you directly. This is not a condemnation. I say that with complete sincerity, and I believe Padre Pio would say it too. For all his severity in the confessional, Padre Pio was not a man who condemned. He was a man who saw clearly, with a clarity that sometimes moved him to tears, what was happening to the people in front of him. The damage he saw was real, but so was the love that grieved over it. He refused absolution not to punish, not to shame, not to deliver a verdict. He refused it because he refused to give comfort that cost the person nothing, when what they needed was truth that could change everything. There is a kind of cruelty, he seemed to understand, in affirming people toward a direction that is quietly destroying them. What I have been describing, the spiritual circuit, the invisible door, the gradual draining of something neither partner can name, is not a permanent sentence. The door can be closed. This is the point. This is the entire point. Those couples who changed course, who renounced contraception and began natural family planning, sometimes long into their marriage, sometimes after years of that hollow distance, wrote afterward in language that surprised even themselves. I felt like I was meeting him again for the first time. I started seeing her again. Something came back that we hadn't even known was gone. That return. That re-seeing. That reconnection that defied rational explanation. It is not accidental. It is not psychology. It is not the placebo effect of a lifestyle change. It is what the restoration of the spiritual circuit produces. When the act is again ordered toward what it was designed for, when the openness to life is restored, even in seasons where no child results, something changes in the spiritual architecture of the marriage. Something that was blocked begins to flow again. Something that was draining out begins to return. Dr. Ripperger has said, and he says this carefully, based on years of pastoral work with hundreds of couples, that the single most consistent catalyst for the restoration of genuine marital intimacy in marriages where that intimacy had quietly died was the renunciation of contraception. Not marriage counseling, not therapy, not a better communication framework. The closing of a door that had been left open. Now, here is what I want you to understand about that closing. It is not easy. It is not smooth. One woman described the early months of natural family planning as genuinely difficult. She said something about having to actually talk to each other, about timing, about bodies, about desire, about when and whether. That was uncomfortable and sometimes frustrating. But something about having to actually choose, she wrote, having to look at each other and decide, forced us to see each other as people again, not just bodies present in the same house, people, with will, with dignity. Not just bodies. That phrase. The woman reduced to an instrument of enjoyment, as Paul VI predicted. The man who stopped seeing. The marriage that becomes two people efficiently coexisting. And then, the reversal. The man who begins to see again. The woman who is seen. That is what changes when the door closes. Go back to that dinner table for a moment, your hands around the glass of wine, his eyes on his plate, the conversation that moves through the room between you, but does not quite land. That distance you feel. I want to be careful here, because I am not standing in your kitchen, and I cannot know the specific shape of your marriage or the particular reasons for the distance you live with. I would not claim to. But if what you have been feeling has that particular quality, the hollow adequacy, the logistical efficiency, the correct affection without warmth, the sense that something invisible is simply absent, then I want to offer you something that I had to learn late, after 35 years of teaching theology from textbooks. The distance in your marriage might not be a relationship problem. It might be a spiritual one. And that distinction matters enormously, because relationship problems respond to relationship solutions, to communication, to therapy, to date nights and vulnerability and the hard work of choosing to understand the person in front of you. And all of those things are good. They are genuinely good. I am not dismissing them. But if the source of the distance is in the spiritual order, if there is an opening in the invisible architecture of your marriage, an open door that has been admitting something that does not belong there, then no communication strategy will close it, because it is not a communication problem. Padre Pio understood this. It is why he could sit across from a couple who appeared entirely fine, no visible crisis, no dramatic failure, no obvious problem, and see with his supernatural clarity what was actually happening, and why his response was never a recommendation for better dialogue. He was not a marriage counselor. He was something older than that. Something that understood the actual architecture of what marriage is. Not as a social institution, not as a legal arrangement, not as a partnership of compatible personalities, but as a sacramental bond in which the living God actively participates. A bond that has a structure that can be damaged, and damage that can be healed. What a couple does in the intimacy of their marriage, what they open, what they close, what they permit, has consequences in the spiritual order, real ones, not metaphorical ones, not theological abstractions, real consequences that show up in the way a man looks at his wife across a dinner table, in whether he sees her or sees through her, in whether the warmth is there or whether something efficient and hollow has replaced it. This is what Paul VI saw in 1968. This is what Padre Pio saw across decades in the confessional of San Giovanni Rotondo. This is what Frater Ripperger and Frater Amorth have documented in their pastoral work with afflicted marriages. The invisible becomes visible when you know what to look for. I want to close with something I have not said yet. 3 years ago, I lost my wife, Margaret. We were married for 39 years. We were not perfect. No marriage is, and I would not dishonor her memory by pretending otherwise. There were hard seasons of grief and distance and ordinary misunderstanding, and the 1,000 small ways that two people fail each other over decades. We were human, fully human, but I can tell you something about those 39 years that I could not have articulated when we were young and thought we understood what marriage was. We were never roommates. Not once. Even in the hardest seasons, even in the distance and the misunderstanding, there was a current. Something flowing. Something that connected us at a level below the surface of whatever we were struggling with. I did not understand its source when I was young. I understand it better now. I believe, for reasons I cannot prove and will not pretend to prove, that what we had was a spiritual architecture that held us even when we were not paying close attention to it. Even when we were failing each other in the smaller ways that spouses always do. I tell you this not to make the divorced feel judged, or the childless feel diminished, or those in painful marriages feel that something is wrong with them that was not wrong with me. I tell you because what I found in Padre Pio's letters, what Ripperger confirmed, what Paul VI described 58 years ago, is not theological theory. It is as real as the distance you feel across that dinner table, and as real as the moment when that distance, through whatever grace, however it comes, suddenly closes. The distance in your marriage is not a sentence. It is a symptom. Symptoms can be understood, and sometimes, not always, not magically, not without effort and grace and genuine willingness to look honestly, they can be addressed at their source rather than managed at their surface. Padre Pio refused absolution to those couples not because he had given up on them, because he had not. He refused because he could see what they could not, and he loved them too honestly to pretend otherwise. He believed, with the certainty of a man who had spent his life in the reality of the supernatural, that the door he could see standing open could also be closed, that what had been opened could be shut, that what God joined and what had been partially severed could be rejoined. The love you are searching for across that dinner table has not disappeared. It has not evaporated. It may be behind a door that was opened, quietly and without ceremony, without either of you fully understanding what you were doing. You can close that door. If this conversation has reached something real in you, if something I said tonight has finally named what you have been carrying without a name, I want to ask something of you. This channel exists because I keep going back to Padre Pio's actual words, not the comfortable version, not the sanitized theological summary, the words that made people leave his confessional in tears of recognition, the words that were severe precisely because they were honest, the words that believed in the person enough to refuse them comfortable lies. And that work, reading the primary sources, gathering the testimonies, sitting with what is difficult to articulate and then articulating it anyway, takes sustained time and attention. If what you encountered here tonight was worth something to you, super thanks is one way to say so. And when you do, you are not merely supporting a channel. You are saying, this kind of conversation matters. Keep having it. Because there are thousands of couples sitting at dinner tables right now, feeling that specific distance, having no language for what it is and no framework for where it came from. The language exists. Padre Pio left it behind. Paul VI wrote it down in 1968. 4. Ripperger has spent decades tracing its contours in pastoral work. This channel exists to bring those voices to the people who need them. Now I want to hear from you. If you made a change in your marriage, if you moved from contraception to natural family planning, or came to this question from any direction, and something in your marriage shifted in ways you still cannot fully explain in rational terms, write it in the comments. You do not need theological language. Just what changed, what came back, what you noticed that you had not been able to name before, because the sentence you write might be the one that someone else needs to read tonight, sitting at their own dinner table, trying to find words for something they cannot yet name. God bless you, and stay vigilant.